Firstly, what I'd like to do is acknowledge the Gadigal people, the traditional owners of the land which we're meeting today, and pay my respect to elders past and present. And I also would like to acknowledge all the Aboriginal and Islander people here today. And I also believe that I've got much to learn from you, your history and your culture. Managing funding changes and building a sustainable sector. Pretty dry subject, didn't quite get a full room. And can be a very technical subject as well. So what I want to do now is appeal to both the left-brain people in the room and the right-brain people in the room. So let's have a crack first at the left-brain people. So left-brain people are logical thinkers. So first off, I'm standing here in a suit and you're making a judgment about what I am, what I do, organisation that I represent. So I'll bounce that pretty quickly. Community sector banking is a joint venture between Bendigo and Adelaide Bank. So it's half owned by Bendigo and Adelaide Bank and half owned by a company called C21. And C21 is made up of 38 not-for-profit organisations, and we specialise in providing financial and banking services specifically for the not-for-profit sector. So we are a business-to-business organisation. And some of our shareholders are a mixture of job network organisations, social service organisations, but also housing. So some of our shareholders are community housing providers. I've been with community sector banking for 18 months as their CEO. I am not a banker. I'm actually an engineer. So my background is engineering, and every time I change jobs, I change industries. But for the past 7 years, I've been a director of a community housing provider in Victoria. When I joined that housing provider 7 years ago, it had about 200 homes. It's now got about 2,500 homes. It did, I've got to say it, wraparound services to about 1,000 people a year. Now it does 10,000 people a year. So I've got a little bit of the knowledge of how to fund the industry, a little bit of knowledge of getting money from the sector, and a little bit of knowledge about how to build businesses. But it was really interesting when I spoke, when I actually had a look with regards to my notes, which I took down yesterday, and I was just thinking about what Shane said yesterday and Shane said today. You can either have a deficit mindset where everything which we're talking about today and yesterday is about expenditure, or you can have a solutions mindset where what we're actually looking at is how do we change and come to solutions. And I think Wendy said yesterday that we've also got to be realistic about the size of the problem, because once we actually have my laptop hit the floor, once we actually have an understanding of our starting point and ending point, then we can kind of figure out how to get from one to the other. That's the engineer in me. It's no good thinking this is the solution, or sorry, this is the end goal, and we think we're going to start from here when actually we're starting from here. It's two completely different journeys. So many stats yesterday. Remember, I'm appealing to the logical thinkers in the room. So many stats yesterday. One ripped off the page for me. 11,000 families, Indigenous families, earning less than $40,000 a year, wanting to get a home in New South Wales. $300,000 land house package is an average, say it's $400,000. All of a sudden there's a $4 billion problem which we've got to solve. That's up here. If we look at housing in Australia, last night 100,000 people didn't know where they were going to sleep, and there's waiting lists of about 200,000. 300,000 homes, 300,000 people waiting for a home, $400,000 a home, roughly. That's $120 billion problem. So what we've got to figure out, if we've got a $120 billion problem, what's government doing to help? Just rip around all the states, do every particular announcement out there, add them all up, and it comes to about $10 billion. Double it, because I got my numbers wrong. It's $20 billion. Double it again, because I'm really got my numbers wrong. There's $40 billion over the next 5 years. We've got an $80 billion shortfall. So that's the size of the problem. And the issue is, traditional ways of actually trying to go and get the solutions aren't going to work. So when I go back to Shane, got to come with a solution mindset. How do we do things differently? The problem has been many years in the making. I'm telling you stuff you already know. So there's no changes to that whatsoever. But what we've got to do is figure out how to actually make the solution. I see there's 6 players in the game. There's government, state and federal. That's probably the 2. There is the banks. There's the client. There's the ACHPs or CHPs, There's also super funds, and there's also the philanthropic or the philanthropists, and that's a difficult word for me to say, the philanthropists. So we've got to figure out what is the role in each one of those, where do they play, how do they play, and how can they play differently? Because it's fair to say that we cannot rely on government alone. If you take that 20 to 30 to $40 billion worth of announcements, it's only 10 by the way, and if I get it wrong, it's still not enough to fix the problem. And we should not have the problems in Australia that we have today with regards to housing and homelessness. If Finland can wake up and solve homelessness in their country by will, determination and investment, not expenditure, investing in it, then it's how we actually communicate and change those sorts of things. So one of the things which we actually have to look at is that intergenerational commitment to multiple solutions and changes in behaviour. So does that kind of make sense? So firstly, here's the size of the problem. We've got 6 players. Everyone's got to change a little bit differently. So now let's flip to the emotional side, the right-brained people sitting in the room. So I'm going to bore you shitless. Sorry, you will be able to edit that out. Banks. The history of banks. Banks started out in the 1400s as a way of creating wealth. Not profit, wealth. Those that had more money than what they needed to maintain their lifestyle, lending to people that wanted to be in a position to improve and increase their lifestyle. And that lifestyle included housing, well-being, competency, all those sorts of things. Somehow in the last 20 years, 30 years, we've turned banks into profit machines, which it's not. So the conversation, we need to have an awakening around the conversation that this is about wealth creation. So it is about bricks, it's about mortar, it's about resilience, it's about capability. I think I've tried very hard to use every single word bar wraparound, but it is about how do you invest actually in the person as well as their environment. Banks are the most efficient, effective way to be able to move money around Australian society. But everyone plays a role in that. ACHPs need to be able to deal with banks and deal with the banking environment in a way which is not that foreign to banks. And banks need to be in a position to be able to deal with ACHPs and other organisations. So there's this matching of communications and understanding. Ken Langston, who's going to be talking next, Ken comes from a long background of actually running a mainstream CHP in Australia. And when I joined mainstream CHPs 7 years ago, there was not the relationship between CHPs and the banks than there is now. Both parties changed. Both parties started to talk to each other differently and engage with each other differently. So banks are part of the solution and we're also part of the problem, and banks need to understand your businesses better and you need to understand them better. So the boring technical takeaway bit today is you've got to change the way that you run and the way that you present yourself, because banks lend, the motto of banks are people lend to people. Okay? So when that proverbial hits the fan and something's going a bit wobbly, then it's about, do I trust you to be able to work with the bank and have the skill set to get the business to where it needs to be? Or if you've got a growth strategy or a change strategy, then you've got to be able to deal with the banks in the language and the methodology and the skill set which they have. So it's a highly regulated sector, the banking industry. So there's rules about what you can and can't do. But the things that you've got to understand is when banks are looking at an ACHP today and say, you guys want to get 10 times the size, build 100 new homes, 5 new homes, whatever it is, they're going to look at things like who's on your board, what skills do they have, what's the skills of the people running the organisation, what skin do you actually have in the game? So what's at risk for you and what's at risk for me? How do we work together, and do I think I can work with you? There's lots of other forms to fill out, but that's kind of fundamentally it. So the takeaways that I'd like to actually leave is, there's a few. Remember I said we've got maybe say, $50 to $80 billion shortfall. Sounds like a really big number, doesn't it? Any idea in here how big the superannuation funds are in Australia? Anyone got an idea? Chuck out a number.
2 trillion?
It's $2 trillion. 2,000 billion dollars. 2,000 billion. So if we've got 40 billion as a whole, 2%. It's only 2%. Did you know that superannuations at the moment invest more money in social and affordable housing overseas than they do in Australia? Do you know they've got more money in Canada, UK and America than they do in Australia? I reckon that's wrong. The reason why I reckon it's wrong is the superannuation business, that $2 trillion, came about because Paul Keating said we will have mandated super in Australia. It was legislated. So it has been a government-built industry which is growing year on year. They have a social and a moral obligation to deal with issues in Australia. The reason why they're going to Canada, UK and USA is because they have regulated industries over there. They have mature conversations between banks and the housing providers. They understand the skill sets, capabilities, etc. And they're 10 to 15 years ahead of we are in Australia. So when I said, do we have a problem? Yes. Do we have a solution? Yes. The solution works something like this. Remember those players which I said? The first one is the housing provider. You guys have assets, you have land, you have houses. There are things which you have at the moment which you can leverage. You need to work with the bank, because banks are very good at supporting building stuff. So they are like 1 to 3 year lending, roughly. Superannuation organisations are really good at that 10 to 20 year lending. So you've got to figure out how you can be attractive and an investment opportunity for a bank. The bank works with you as a pathway to then be able to bundle things up and work with superannuations to unlock that $2,000 billion or a portion of it. The government you need to work with differently by increasing your skill and capability so that they will actually provide a role of supporting you. Not with a cheque, but supporting you, guaranteeing outcomes, and etc. And the philanthropic market, which Ken will touch on, is now wanting to get outcomes where they see critical improvement in people's skill sets and capabilities. I'd like to talk about one example that is a housing provider in Victoria, which if you look at my bio, you've got probably a good idea who that is. They did a project where they built 23 residential units for long-term people who are homeless or at risk of homeless or being homeless. And they were able to get some government money to be able to assist in buying the land. They could use that to leverage to borrow some money so they could actually build on the land. They did some fundraising locally to assist in some of the mechanics of how it was built. And they got the Sydney Myer Foundation to donate money. The Sydney Myer Foundation didn't donate money for the operational side or the capital investment side, that's running the business or actually building the houses. They said, we want to invest in a training capability in that facility so that the people that go in can actually come out with a greater skill. We want them to get a Cert 3, 4 or a diploma, associate diploma in something. We want our measurement of success is not number of the houses we have, but resilience and capability. And if there's that element around self-determination and self-governance and self-leadership, then that's a really, really important thing. The other thing is that brutal acceptance of facts. We've got a big problem which has taken decades to create. It's going to take us we can't wait for generations to fix it, but it's going to be something which we need to apply some consistent and long-term commitment to. We've now got a new risk, and I'm not telling you anything new, but I'd like to reinforce it: political risk. We've got one-term governments. So your policy of yesterday is no longer the policy today, and bloody hell, it could change tomorrow. So if you don't know what sort of political environment you're working in, then you don't know what sort of revenues that you used to get from government is going to be. All I can say is don't rely on it. Figure out how to get a game plan for a government, a game plan for a super fund, a game plan for a bank, and a game plan for a philanthropic association. And figure out, look at your business not from a problem point of view, but a leveraging point of view. Because everyone that I've spoken to today and yesterday has talked about the need to partner. The problem is too big, you can't do it yourself, you've got to partner. But you've got to partner as an equal. You can't partner and then be subservient. So where you have the biggest skills and capability for someone like me is the local knowledge, the local connections, and the local nuances. You also have in-country assets and capabilities which you need to have a look at a little bit differently. And it's more of a collective conversation. Don't have one person in the room. Try to get those 5 people in a room and figure out what your problem is and have that conversation. So in wrapping up, so make sure we get back on time, 4 questions to ask yourself, or your board should be asking yourself, or your exec should be asking yourself, or you should be asking yourself, is what do we have today that we can leverage to aid our long-term sustainability and growth? The second question is, what are our gaps? If we're going to be attractive to someone to invest in, not to donate to, but to invest in, what are my real gaps that I have? Is it at the board level? Is it at the exec level? Do I need some skill sets, etc.? The third thing is, how do I change the conversation with all my suppliers and relationships from profit to wealth? And wealth measures are not just financial. Resilience, capability, long-term reduction in social service payments and reliance on welfare, self-determination, productivity, lots of things. And I'm not saying that we've got to go from here to here, but how do we actually get a pathway of improvement of those sorts of things, and how do I measure that locally? And thank goodness that's not me, because the last 2 conferences I've gone to, my phone has actually rung off. And one of them was when Shane was talking, so I felt like an absolute git. The last thing is, in all times when you do something, you've got to figure out what is the value you're trying to create, but importantly, what is the value you're trying to protect? You've got to have that. That's the one carved inside. What am I trying to protect? What am I trying to create? And what am I prepared to put on the table to leverage a way to get a better outcome? So with those sorts of things, I believe that there is enough capital in Australia to solve our problem. We just don't apply it and mobilise it as we should. It's more complex than it was yesterday, but get those 5 or 6 people in a room when you've got a problem and partner as an equal. Because there's got to be enough that you're different. There's got to be enough that the same that you want to do and achieve the same outcomes, but there's got to be enough difference to make it interesting. Because if you're exactly the same, you don't need each other, and you just have a brother, bigger, someone more powerful than you. That doesn't work. You need to partner with equal and realise what you have to offer. So with that, I'll wait for questions at the end. Thanks, guys.
Well, no, we're going to do a couple of questions now, because I think with 3 speakers we can actually do that. I'd like to actually ask you one before I hand it over to the rest of the delegates. So the AHO in its act, everybody hears the phrase Section 21, which is actually one of the sections in our legislation which enables us to place effectively caveatable interests on properties. It's like that all around the country. So the stock is not to be lost, because the Eagle banks will take it off them if something happens to the organisation. how does the community banking sector, how does a provider deal with that? Because certainly historically, when properties were transferred, the government was considering signing tripartite agreements, which would effectively make them the lender of last resort. They'd pay out the debt. That stopped with the change of government, and it's not coming back anytime soon because the AAA credit rating is everything, even though they're in the black. But other states, I believe, still do it. But that's one of the biggest single barriers. We keep hearing leverage, 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 but effectively leverage just means you're borrowing, right?
Yep.
So how do you borrow on assets that have a caveatable interest?
So there were, and as Ken said yesterday, from a caveat point of view, most of our lending has a caveat across it anyway. When I first started in the mainstream community housing provider market, and it used to be very specific. It used to be project-based. It used to be asset-backed security. It used to be small lends, and it used to be really aggressive covenants on that industry. Fast forward 7 years, so it's gone from being project by project lending to more like portfolio lending. So we understand the capability of the organisation. Instead of just this block of land, we've got this capability of the organisation, so it's more portfolio based. What are you trying to achieve? Flexibility. It's more don't quote me on this, and now it's going to be on camera, so it will be. But it's more like, how do you actually have a line of credit rather than just around a specific project? The second thing is that it used to be security backed, so it's asset backed. Realistically, it's more now understanding cash flow. You've got to be able to present yourself as a business around cash flow. They're cash flow lens rather than security lens. They will be security backed, sorry, they will be asset backed. But do you really think that a bank wants to be on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald saying that we've kicked 100 single mums out of Woolloomooloo? It's just not going to happen. You've got to figure out how to work around the cash flow side rather than the security side. It will be security, but it's the cash flow. When you invest in cash flow, a bank looks at things such as, what's the quality of the board? Do they have the finance skill set on the board? Do they have the developer skill set on the board? In a asset lending situation, it's lazy lending. It goes pear-shaped, ta-da, I'm going to sell your house. Very lazy. In cash flow lending, it's more complex. Do you have the skills, the capability, the reputation? Have you done this before? Where have you failed before but learnt from it? All those sorts of things. So to go to your understanding, to go to your question, we work with organisations. So there's CHPs that we've lent with, mainstream CHPs that we've lent to for 7 to 9 years. And before, as Ken said, we used to put so much covenant on them, they'd disappear down saying, bloody hell. But now that we actually understand how they do it and they've done some loans, they come up again and we go, oh, right, they're the disciplines that I need in place, the governance, the policies, the registration, etc. So what Shane's doing is actually saying, I don't know, this is my interpretation. Shane's saying, we've got a huge problem. We've got to change. We've done some great work, but we've got to accelerate the change to fix it. Accreditation is something which we actually need to get for us to be able to get more attractive for more funding, because we need those skill sets in place and the disciplines of accreditation so that someone outside can say, okay, I trust these people, because banking is about trust. I trust these people, I'm going to lend, have a crack.
Thank you. And sorry, I know that was my question. Does anybody else have one question before we move on? Yes.
Oh, and I thought it was boring and dry.
I'm just a bit keen to find out some of the... you said you did work for a community housing provider in Victoria, and it obviously grew quite quickly. What are some of the key elements, or what are the things that they did to build that growth over that period?
Multiple things. So this is probably the single learning which I can say is there is no single solution. It is going to be a bit different to each community and each requirement, because whilst we're talking about Aboriginal and Islander accommodation as a global thing, it's really different depending on area, etc. So what they did was they actually had a change. If I do it in kind of dominoes, they firstly said, we're going to change our mindset. We're going to take control of our future rather than being reliant on others. So if we're going to control our future, how do we look at what we have today and see what it can be? And how do we then take some steps to get us from where we need to be today to the future? So they actually had a long-term plan about, here's a 5 to 10 year, and what we actually need is to go from where we're totally reliant on government, where we turn the government into a partner. And there is difference between actually just having a different sort of relationship with a government or a bank, a government department and a bank, and being a true partner. So they'd go to the government and say, we've got a $10 million project we want to do. We actually don't want your money. And the government goes, what? What we need for you is to go guarantor whilst we're going through the construction phase. Because we've got the land, but it was gifted to us. And we don't want to lose the land if things go pear-shaped. So we're going to use a builder that is going to be reputable. You, government, can choose the builder, but ultimately, if it goes pear-shaped, we want you to be the one that comes in and fixes it, because we don't want to lose the land. And so the government said, what? You're not writing a cheque, I just need to be a guarantor. Yes. Okay, that's a little bit different. Do that once, everyone works through and says, well, that's successful. Do it second time, third time, suddenly you cookie-cutter approach. So there's elements where the government plays the prime role. There's elements where the philanthropic company plays the prime role. But the biggest thing was a mindset changed. We will take control of the future, and we turn from being, although we are a not-for-profit, we are a for-purpose company. So we will be in intent. So we will be community-oriented, but commercially run. And that's probably the biggest takeaway. You've got to be commercially run. So get the skill sets on the board or get the skill sets in the business. And if you can't get them on the board or in the business, then get a trusted partner that you can actually rely on.